It is a pleasure to see all of you here tonight. I'm Jim Ludes. I am Executive Director of the Pell Center here at Salve and Vice President for Strategic Initiatives. We had originally planned this event back in September, thinking that we would be amidst another replay of electoral angst and uncertainty, wondering what the process was going to entail, wondering what the next few weeks were going to hold. And that's not where we are. So this may have been a better idea in September than it is tonight, but we're here. We're going to have a good conversation. I'm going to introduce just a really tremendous panel of colleagues and friends for the event tonight. Before I do, though, I just want to say a couple of things in terms of ground rules for tonight. This is the end of a very contentious and divisive electoral process, as they seem to be in the United States these days. We're hoping to be able to process some of what happened over the course of the campaign and in the last couple of days as a group tonight. It's probably reasonable to assume that some of us in this room are not happy with the outcome of the election. It's also equally valid that there are probably people in the room who are happy with the outcome. And so I would just ask everybody to please be respectful, to avoid personal attacks, ad hominem arguments, to respect the difference of opinions that are part of a community. I spent a lot of my time working on trying to think of ways to bring people together around common issues, to build out the center in American politics. And part of that begins with us being willing to listen and empathize with other perspectives. So I would invite you to join us in that project tonight and to do our best to try to process as a group what we think just happened, and we'll see where the conversation takes us. To my immediate left is Mary Anderson, who is a member of the political science faculty here at Salve Regina University. She's also the inaugural David and Carolyn Brodsky Chair in American Constitutional Democracy and Culture. Did I get that right?
Tell me.
Okay. Seated next to Mary is Dr. Bill Leeman, who is a professor of history, a presidential historian, and a great colleague in the Department of History. And certainly on the end, but last but not least is what I'm trying to say, is Janine Weisman, who's editor-in-chief of the Rhode Island Current and a longtime political reporter here in the state of Rhode Island. So we're going to start with a little conversation amongst the four of us, and then we're going to open it up to some conversation, some questions, some observations, and we'll see where this takes us. So I want to start with one big open-ended question. And Mary, I'm going to start with you. I'll put you in the hot seat first. What happened yesterday?
Former President Trump overperformed, did much better than he did in 2020. And Kamala Harris did not meet Joe Biden's numbers from 2020. And so she underperformed really across the board in terms of turning out some key demographics that she needed. And, you know, when I started watching Georgia come in and he was hitting his margins and doing a little bit better, especially once the mail-in vote was counted, and she was not. That was a signal that things were going to probably keep going, and then you saw it in North Carolina, and then you started seeing it in some of the really important swing districts across the swing states.
Bill, same question.
Yeah, so I think for me, kind of my big takeaway from it is just the power that anger can have, fear can have in a presidential election. We've seen it several times throughout American history. Sometimes that works in favor of the Democrats, like 1932. Franklin Roosevelt's overwhelmingly elected because people were fearful because of the Great Depression, and people were angry at Herbert Hoover. We saw it again, 1968, Richard Nixon, when he's elected president. One of the big things he's known for is his Southern strategy, capitalizing on fear and anger among white Southerners who had concerns about the civil rights movement and the direction the country was going in, and that proved to be very powerful for him politically. I think we have to put 2024 in the same category as these other historic elections where the big motivating factor for many people is fear and anger about what's going on in the country and the direction the country's going in.
Thanks, Bill. Janine,
Great. Did I turn this on correctly?
say something.
Say something, say something. I lost it without my glasses. Can you hear me?
You were better
Okay,
before, I
good.
think.
So last night, what happened? Well, I sat down when the polls closed at 8 p.m. with my butt in the chair and my laptop, and I didn't get up for several hours. I spent my night focused mostly on Rhode Island races, our ballot questions, the Constitutional Convention, and then over here on this tab, I would check in once in a while on the presidential race. And I think finally, as things were going and spinning and crazy, I looked at it and I was, that was my gut reaction. At least I didn't swear, but it was more of a And then we live in interesting times, and this is going to get really interesting now. So when I was asked, thank you for being on this panel, and it was a while ago, and we thought it was going to be completely different, I'm thinking, I better go read that Wikipedia page on the Electoral College again, just so that I get this right. Now, we're not arguing about it at all. There's no complaints of fraud. It's just more of a gut punch, really, that people feel, where do we go from here and what are we supposed to do? I'm the journalist, so I get to just ask the questions. I don't have to have the answers. But I can tell you that from last night, watching the DC channel, which is one of the Slack channels I have, just going and going and going. It was intense. There was a lot of emotion happening. And just the stress levels were up. And it was like you couldn't keep up with everything. Yeah. You know, even though it was slowly boiling away, and we were waiting for Alaska till, what time did Alaska actually happen at? I don't know. But it was just quite the experience to sit through and monitor, and it's a night like no other, I would call it.
Yeah. Hey, so Mary, you mentioned President-elect Trump overperformed. One of the things that struck me in looking at some of the exit surveys were the inroads that he made in some traditionally Democratic constituencies, particularly Latino and Black men. Do you have any idea about what explains his ability to, I mean, we're not talking insignificant inroads, we're talking 5 to 7%, and that mirrors the 5 to 7% gains that he made between 2020 and now across the country. That's a substantial growth of your electorate.
Yeah, so usually when we think about identity politics, right, we usually think about underrepresented groups. So we think about minority groups, we think about women, what the former president was able to do in this campaign was tap identity politics for men. And that's something that the Harris campaign didn't have an answer for. They hadn't been talking to men in the same way that the former president was. And he made a really concerted effort to go after men across all demographic groups, you know, appearing on male-dominated podcasts like Rogan, and really just appealing to, you know, they're tired of being beat down and beat up since the, you know, Me Too movement, and, you know, I'm here to help you, and I'm gonna, you know, be your champion, and I think it really resonated with men. And then on the other side, you know, women just didn't turn out in the numbers that I think the Harris campaign expected. I think they thought that reproductive rights would really push women, particularly suburban women, those soccer moms that we hear so much about, and that didn't materialize. And, you know, I was listening earlier today that, you know, perhaps part of it is because reproductive rights have been on so many state ballots that women were thinking, well, it's gonna happen at the state level. The protections are going to be there, so maybe I don't need to worry about it. I don't need to vote for a Kamala Harris. I can still vote with my pocketbook. And the economy was really front and center.
Well, and it's remarkable too. If you just look at the percentage of women that Democrat and the Democratic candidate versus Donald Trump over the last 3 elections, Harris's margin is smaller than Biden, who is smaller than Clinton, and that's just a stunning trajectory given all of the focus that's been placed on them. Bill, you mentioned fear in various presidential campaigns throughout American history. How do you fight fear in electoral context?
Well, again, I think going back to 1932, you look at how Franklin Roosevelt dealt with that, and part of the way he did that was through very positive, very uplifting language. If you look at the text of his inaugural address, one of the most famous inaugural addresses in history, he's talking about there's nothing to fear but fear itself. That wasn't true. I mean, there was a lot to fear at the time. I mean, you had millions of people unemployed. You had homelessness, you had starvation, you had malnourishment. I mean, there was a lot of bad things going on in the country at that time. But he was trying to create a more positive atmosphere. He had seen how Herbert Hoover's more negative, or I don't know how you want to describe it, but lack of effective public relations during Hoover's presidency had caused him serious problems. And Roosevelt knew instinctively the American people needed hope in something. And so in that case, I think the way he was dealing with the fear was certainly his tone, but also something like, so I just talked about this yesterday with my American presidency students, but Roosevelt's fireside chats, his first fireside chat, where he's talking about the banking crisis and why he shut down the banks in the United States. One of the ways he dealt with that fear is by talking to the American people in an unprecedented way. I mean, the American people had heard presidents give speeches on the radio. They had never heard a president talking to them in a conversational style on the radio. They had never had a president actually explain a particular policy to them, why he was doing what he was doing. If you read the transcript of that fireside chat, it's actually a really good description of how banking in the United States works. And so for Roosevelt, one of the ways he's going to deal with that fear and try to get the country past that fear is by explaining things to the American people, kind of being like teacher in chief to an extent. So he's telling people, why did this banking crisis happen? He's telling people who to blame, because he's enough of a savvy political operator. He knows if he doesn't blame somebody else, he's going to get the blame. So he directs the blame at somebody else. But he also explains what he's doing and why he's doing it, and he's explaining it in a way that everybody can understand. And according to historians who have studied this, Roosevelt, when he was giving fireside chats, he imagined he was talking to his gardener at his estate in Hyde Park, New York. And that's how he was able to adopt a tone that everybody could easily understand. And so I think that's one example of how you deal with it.
You know, and one of the things that's always fascinated me about Roosevelt in that era is his use of the latest, newest technology, radio, to reach a mass audience. Donald Trump has been a monster on social media for years now. He also, I think, demonstrates a real skill and real deftness with the way he uses information to shape what we're talking about, to shape what journalists are reporting on, and what's actually getting coverage. So, Vice President Harris was criticized a lot for not having a plan. And candidate Trump has ideas of a suggestion of a plan for reforming health care, but that didn't get nearly the kind of attention that the Vice President Harris's effort to grapple with the economic situation. As a journalist, sorry to put you on the hot seat and speak for the entire industry, but what role does the media have? What role do journalists have in the way we're talking about and thinking about these issues in 2024?
Our role is to go out and find out, what is to observe what's happening and report back. But hopefully, with all of that, the observations that we're applying, we're developing some sort of some way to interpret why this is the moment where these things are happening. So it's not enough to go and just quote the outrageous things that are said at this rally. Which, if you were following some of the rallies that were happening, they were hours long, right? There were times when Donald Trump was killing time, dancing around the stage, doing this, and then it was back to the stand-up routine or whatever he was doing. And so much of the coverage was focused on the things that were being said that were in the middle of something, the things that are going to laugh, that are going to make people upset and angry, right? And he speaks off the cuff, right? And so we drill down onto some of those things, and we don't get to the policy stuff necessarily. So I think that's the frustrating part is, and because I have so for States Newsroom, just as an aside, for you who are unfamiliar with it, we have 39 state capital outlets and partners so that we have representation in all 50 states. So I just want to say I felt like so glad at times that I was not the Pennsylvania editor-in-chief because she worked every weekend. There was always something, that was involved, and I would look at her comments because she would be at some of these rallies, and she's like, you can't believe what people are saying. And often the media are sitting in front. The last rally was the only way someone could take aim at me would be from over there where the media is sitting, remember?
Yeah.
And so the media's uneasy, and so you have this dynamic between the candidate and the people who are there to cover it and report back about what's happening, and there's already this adversarial relationship. You're just there to observe and see what people are responding to, and then it becomes something more than that.
Do you, so you've covered Rhode Island politics for a long time. Any surprises in the results locally here in Rhode Island that stand out to you as being, well, that was interesting?
Oh, yes. Well, in every single one of our 39 communities yesterday, the Republican presidential candidate secured more votes than 4 years ago. Every single one. In Central Falls, and I was telling Jim this earlier, more than a third of the voters in little, densely populated Central Falls, with its heavily Latino population, a lot of problems with a housing crunch, it's just, it's tiny. It was only 25% 4 years ago, and it grew to over a third. So you saw those kinds of significant changes. So people vote based on their police attitudes, their beliefs, and their values. So what combination thereof has been changing in 4 years? And so to me, these are like the really interesting questions to look at. But something here in Rhode Island is just, it's not like we're all that different from the rest of the country. Can I just say that I had this inferiority complex being the Rhode Island editor because, there's 7 other editors, each from a swing state, that were sort of spending more time getting more attention from our headquarters. And there were times when I was glad that I didn't have that. But what we saw happen yesterday was that just like everywhere else, we're seeing this growth of more of these people willing to vote Republican based on something. And we have to find out what that is,
Just a moment of professional pride and frankly bragging. But the Pell Center survey that my colleague Katie Langford-Sonder put together at the end of the summer that we released last month was within 1 percentage point in every race that we surveyed in Rhode Island. So we were frankly nervous about particularly the presidential numbers that we saw, because we had a 14% margin between Harris and Trump, and the University of New Hampshire was saying 20%. Yeah. And Joe Biden had won with 20% back in 2020. And we said, well, did we screw up our methodology? Apparently not. But that, in retrospect, was maybe something that we should have paid a little bit more attention to if her numbers were that soft in Rhode Island, when historically that had been a 20-point margin.
So we had a poll, too, that we did in September. We were the beneficiary of a Knights Election Hub grant, and Mass INC Polling conducted that poll. And we had something similar to your poll. And we did take a little bit of a ribbing online because we weren't what the UNH poll was, right? Yeah. And people were like, what's wrong with your poll? Because you weren't 20.
Wrong sample.
Yeah, like that something was wrong, and I was feeling a little validated by that, know.
Yeah. So, Bill, we've talked a little bit about what happened yesterday. Let's maybe approach this with a little bit longer lens, and think in terms of what did the Harris campaign do right, what did they do wrong, and then what did the Trump campaign do right, and what did they do wrong?
Okay. Starting out with the Harris campaign, I think what they did right is I feel that she ran an excellent campaign, particularly given the small amount of time she had, given President Biden's very, very late exit from the election. I think she far exceeded what most people thought she would be able to do in such a small amount of time.
Can I just follow up on that 1 second? What would she have gained with a longer runway?
I mean, like politics, like anything else, the more experience you get, so in this case, like out on the campaign trail, the better you get at it. So I would like to think I'm a much better professor now than I was the first time I ever taught a course a really long time ago. And it's the same thing with political candidates. If you are part of, like, let's say President Biden stepped out of the election a year ago, and that there was kind of a more traditional Democratic Party primary season, Vice President Harris, along with other candidates, would have had an opportunity to hone their skills, hone their message, get better at that aspect of it. And so, like I said, I think she did a remarkably good job given the small amount of time that she had. But I do think she probably, if she had had more time and gone through a primary and come out on the other side of a primary, I do think she probably would have been an even better candidate. Would that have made a difference? I don't know necessarily, but yeah, I think that was part of the.
Well, so Mary, let's have you pick up on what did the Trump campaign do right? What did they do wrong?
Well, I mean, looking at it now, they didn't do very much wrong. I mean, they moved the needle tremendously. They were able to identify what the key states were that he needed to win, to break down the blue wall in particular, flip Georgia, and to tap into the fear, frustration, anger, and those key demographic groups that we talked about, and that all worked for them. I mean, messaging all over the place, right? I mean, that's never been his forte, but he stuck with the message of, I'm going to be your guy to the men, and that really helped him.
Whoever wants to answer this can. There's a lot of sort of Monday morning quarterback this morning. If you watched any of the cable news channels, people trying to make sense of that very question. What did the Harris campaign in particular do right? What did they do wrong? One of the questions was, would the Democratic Party be capable of any kind of introspection? Right. So one of the refrains that I heard a lot of today was that Democrats were kind of dismissive of people who don't agree with them. And I think that you could make that argument one way or the other. I'm not passing judgment on it, but the ability of a political party, a national political party in the 21st century, to undertake that kind of introspective review of a tensely fought campaign, is that realistic? Is there any historical precedent for that? Whoever wants to grab that one.
I mean, there's always a historical precedent to something. I mean, the thing that I think jumps out to me would be 92, Bill Clinton's campaign in 1992, coming out of the years of the Reagan Revolution, 4 years of George Bush Sr. I think one thing Clinton was very effective at was reorienting the Democratic Party to be a little more moderate, less liberal, kind of present himself as a new Democrat. So, I mean, for me, I think that's the example that jumps to mind most notably.
Yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I think they're fully capable of I mean, they'd really be dumb not to think about what went wrong. But I also think that, in my view, this was really Trump's race to lose. I mean, he had name recognition. I mean, I know he wasn't the incumbent coming immediately out, but he's an incumbent. I mean, you could call him one. He has enormous name recognition, able to raise money, has a huge following, and he's been in the public eye now for 12 years, right? And so I think people know him, they know what they're getting with him, and I think there are folks that were uneasy with Kamala Harris. They don't know her very well, and she only had really 100 days to really make herself known to people, and for some folks, I mean, that's just a bridge too far.
Bill, Donald Trump has been the standard bearer of the Republican Party for 8 years now. At the end of this term, it will be 12 years. Is there any recent historic precedent that corresponds with that, and does that give us any insight to how long the Trump revolution in the GOP will persist?
I mean, to me, what comes to mind is the Reagan Revolution, the impact Reagan had on the Republican Party in the 1980s, which in a lot of ways I feel lasted until Trump came along. So I don't know if that's necessarily an accurate indicator of how long the age of Trump is going to last, but for me, I feel like the most recent historical parallel would be what Reagan did with the Republican Party in the 80s and after.
So Janine, we had originally envisioned that we would pivot the conversation now to sort of talk about what the Electoral College was going to do. We don't have to answer that question anymore, but I'm curious, maybe if we look a little bit further downrange, what do you expect in the first 100 days of the Trump presidency? What are the sort of policy agendas that we're going to see and that we're going to see manifest in the first part of 2025?
Well, he's made clear what the top issues are: economy, immigration, right? Number one and number two. So you'll probably see some movement on there. But the administrative things that happen at the beginning of a presidential. Well, so he's got to hire people. We've got to have the names of who are all the cabinet people going to be. It takes a while to do those types of things. And if you remember the first time that he was in the Oval Office, there was a lot of turnover pretty quickly. Like there was like a revolving door going on, because he asks a lot of the people who work for him, extreme loyalty, right? So I expect to see stuff like that. It will be interesting, and so when we did our poll for Rhode Island Current, we asked about like a dozen or so issues and asked the survey respondents, what's the most important thing to you in this presidential election? And so you saw, like, from each party, what, again, economy and immigration, whereas democracy and reproductive freedom, that the Democrats respondents were saying. And so they didn't align. We asked on that list, the military was one of the topics. It was at the bottom for both parties. It wasn't a concern at all, really, except when we drilled down, more Republicans picked the military as an issue, and younger men did. But I think it's interesting because you saw recently with Senator Reid making his comments and raising lots of concerns about what if it was the next President Trump and what he would be like in terms of being the commander-in-chief. And he had grave concerns about whether he would follow ethics and proper protocols and just understand the Constitution. I think you're going to see suddenly the military maybe becoming a little bit more as a topic of conversation that we weren't willing to have during the election. So I'm kind of interested how that will play out. And then I also read in Political this morning that President Trump is interested in changing the colors of Air Force One, so maybe somebody else has seen that. But he wants to make it dark blue instead of light blue. So we're on notice that is a possibility very early in the administration.
So Mary, when you look at the next 4 years, what are the things that you're looking at? What are the things that you're watching? What do you think that the Trump administration is going to try to accomplish in that time frame?
I think they're probably gonna work on hollowing out some of the bureaucracy. State Department probably not filling positions. I think the rest of the world is watching us. What's gonna happen with NATO? What's gonna happen with some of our alliances? What's gonna happen in Ukraine? As educators, any faculty here in the room, you've probably been getting the emails from, AAC&U and ACE and things like that. What's going to happen to the Department of Education? Is that going to be hollowed out? So I think we're going to see I think we will likely see some structural changes in the bureaucracy. And how that exactly looks, I don't know, but I think that's probably there. And then, what's our role going to be around the world? That might be different than it is today.
Bill, I want to ask you the same broad question, but the Harris campaign made such a focus on the preservation of American democracy. And so I want to give you the same opportunity to ask the same broad question, but I'm hoping you might also reflect on how critical a moment is it in your estimation in terms of the health blood of the American Republic?
Yeah, so I mean, in my opinion, I got this question from a student. It was actually last spring that I got the question. I do actually feel that we're kind of at a moment of reckoning when it comes to the American Republic and our democracy. If we take Donald Trump at his word, I think that democracy is going to be seriously altered over the next 4 years. So, for example, what's going to happen in the Justice Department? That's a big question. Is he actually going to use the Justice Department, like weaponize it against his political enemies? Is he going to go after people like Liz Cheney, for example? So I think that is something I'm certainly curious about. I'm also curious about kind of where the political parties are going to go at this point. I mean, clearly the Republican Party is full-blown MAGA at this point. So that is a profound transformation. I mean, I would argue it hasn't been Abraham Lincoln's party for a really long time, but it is clearly Donald Trump's party at this point. I'm curious what happens to the Never Trumpers. I mean, I don't see them staying allied with the Democrats. I think that was just a marriage of convenience this time out. So where do the Liz Cheneys of the world go at this point? Are they going to start their own sort of conservative third party, break off permanently from the Republican Party, and use like democracy and preserving the republic as one of their marquee issues to unite the people that they're going to recruit to their party? I don't have answers to those, but those are some of the things I was thinking about is what is going to happen to the American political system.
I saw another friend of mine, sent me a text this morning saying that he hoped that there would be an emergence of a sort of a centrist party that would sort of capture that in American politics. Could that work?
I mean, right now it's really hard for me to imagine it working. The two-party system is so ingrained in the United States at this point and grew so quickly right at the beginning of the Republic that I have a hard time imagining that. I mean, certainly there have been anomalies throughout American history. So think like Theodore Roosevelt running for the Progressive Party in 1912 and basically elbowing out the Republican candidate, President Taft at the time. I still see that as just very much an aberration that came about because of Theodore Roosevelt and to use this phrase, the cult of personality around him in a lot of ways. I don't think a lot of other people could have really pulled that off. So, I mean, I've heard people talking about that. I personally have a hard time envisioning what that would look like in reality.
You're in agreement.
Yeah, we are socialized to think about a two-party system. I mean, from the time our kids are itty-bitty, they know the donkey and the elephant, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, right? You see the images everywhere. You see the red, you see the blue, which, by the way, doesn't help polarization. We've got teams, and we root for our teams, and we're very passionate about our teams, and America's very, very excited about their teams. And so, and the way just structurally we're set up, right? The way Congress is set up this is your wheelhouse, but the way Congress is set up, right, in terms of committee, in terms of leadership positions, in terms of the way we vote and we make the rules, all of these things is based on the two-party system. And when you have one or two, they can caucus one way or the other. That's not a big deal. But I think moving to some sort of a multi-party system, while it might be, in my view, healthier for democracy, I don't know that America is at the point of doing that.
Janine, from the colleagues that you have in newsrooms around the country, do you have a sense today of sort of, we know we're up here in deep blue Northeast New England. Mm-hmm. What are you hearing from colleagues in other parts of the country?
Concerns, obviously. They're getting re-energized because everybody's a little sleep deprived. So I think it's still percolating for many of us, but a lot of dread, certainly. And I'm excited as a journalist, though, because I know there's a lot of good stories coming. Not that they wouldn't with the Harris administration, but I guess I don't feel as much dread because I know that this is always going to be good content for. There are always stories to tell, and there's going to be many more questions to ask, right? So, and I don't, maybe I should play psychologist and be like, because you asked about fear,
Yeah.
right? Well, fear can be a healthy emotion, right? Because it sets us up to do something to prevent the bad thing from happening that we are afraid is going to happen, right? So, and I think that's the role that, as a journalist, I get to step into that a bit more and really lean into, finding out what are the worst possible scenarios and anticipating those and looking at the options and the things that we could do. So I think it gives us the opportunity to be more proactive, and maybe, people like to kick around. The Trump campaign doesn't exactly love journalists, right? Well, they love some, depending on, who's interviewing them on Fox News, and they love podcasts, right?
Right.
But I would like to look at this as more of an opportunity, right?
Fair enough. Fair enough. So, folks, we want to give you an opportunity to ask some questions too. So there are a couple of microphones. If you've got a question, raise your hand. The microphone will come to you, and we will do our best to try to get some semblance of an answer offered to you. Whether or not it's a good answer, I don't know. We've got one right down here in the front row. We've got one over here. And we've got a couple here. Yeah, all right, I see you're all coming. So right down in the front row, Teresa. The microphone's coming to you. Just 1 second.
Dennis.
Right here in the front row. And Aaron, you can go right over here.
I think the question that comes up: how did the how did the people in Harris's campaign get the polling information so wrong?
So this is.
It was going to be close. It was going to be this, and all of a sudden, you listen for a couple of hours, and it doesn't look good at all.
Yeah. So this is a question, right? That we chatted about it a little bit before. That have the pollsters calibrated for what the electorate looks like, so that the polls actually on a national level are accurate representations of both the sample, but also generating results that give us a meaningful indication of which way it's going to be. If you just look at what the cable networks were anticipating in terms of their coverage schedules overnight and into today, they did not expect this to be resolved as quickly as it was, and they've spent a lot more. Yeah, they spent a lot more money on polling than we certainly did, right? So do you have a sense of why polls now for multiple? I mean, I'm old enough to remember when there were polls that said John Kerry was going to be president, and Al Gore for that matter too. Why do polls get it so? Why are they so imprecise? Why do they seem more imprecise now than they have historically?
Because I think when you bring new people into the electorate, people who have previously not participated, and I think some of this male coalition that Trump was able to put together, I think they've missed them previously. And so I think, the poll, every time it's like, oh, well, we undersampled, white men without a college education. And so we're going to fix that part of the survey. And now it looks like there's a new coalition that has emerged, and folks who are new into the electorate. And so they have to make adjustments, but it's like they're always playing catch up.
Yeah, polls usually use one or two questions to determine what their sample is going to be. And one of those questions is often, did you vote in the last presidential election? And if the answer is yes, then you're considered a likely voter. If you say, yes, I'm going to vote, I voted last time, I'm going to vote this time, you're a likely voter. And most of the really good surveys that are out there are surveys of likely voters. And so you don't capture new voters coming in, whether they're 18-year-old kids who didn't vote before, or they're voters who just were disenfranchised for whatever reason, by choice or circumstance, previously. So
I do want to say we heard a lot about undecided voters, really. And so what does a poll do with an undecided voter? And that can skew the poll, right?
Yeah.
And a poll is only good for about 30 seconds, and then it's stale, right?
Yeah.
So if you're an undecided voter or you're changing your mind a lot, that poll's not going to be very useful.
Yeah.
And then the latest type of voter, low propensity voter, whatever that's supposed to be. Low information voter, whatever that's supposed to be.
Yeah, do you have?
Yeah, so the low information voter would be a person that doesn't have a ton of information upon which they're making their decision. And that's not necessarily, well, I make the argument in my public opinion class that we have like gut reasoning. This is Samuel Popkin's sort of argument about making decisions, that we know enough about one or two issues to say that this would be our person, that you don't have to know all of their positions on all of the issues, that you can make your correct vote choice with just a little bit of information.
I also think too that the sobriquet of a low information voter is an epithet, and that it's part of the problem that Democrats have is if they talk about low information voters, they are insulting some segment of the electorate that instead they ought to be listening to and trying to get some understanding of so they can talk to them more effectively. But that's just my soapbox moment for the night. We're up here to Leah.
I had a question about youth voters. So I know, like, historically, voters 18 to 29 turn out in way lower numbers. I felt like, and what I was seeing in the media, like the Harris campaign specifically was doing a lot of work on like TikTok and Instagram to target youth voters. Do you think that this is worthwhile for candidates if youth voters aren't turning out? Like, should they be focusing more attention on getting the demographics of people that they know that will turn out for them, or should they still be putting a lot of time and energy into getting the youth voters, even if they're not likely to turn out?
Bill, you wanna?
Gee, that sounds like a question for a political scientist.
Well, we can toss it to Mary.
I mean, when there's only so much money, yes, you want to be very careful about what groups you're targeting. You know, there's a reason why they don't pour a bunch of money into Florida anymore, because Democrats I'm talking about, they're not going to win in Florida anymore. And so I don't know that it's essentially a waste. I think there are many of us, and I think when you're in higher education, that we believe with all our heart that young people are the future, right? That you are going to be the ones to make the difference. And so I would never argue that you shouldn't dump money into try to motivating the youth vote. An economist, someone that's doing campaign strategy, might make a different argument about if that's a good use of resources.
These young people, unfortunately, they're not even getting civics in high school, for God's sakes. That's a killer.
The civics
Trying
is
to
a whole
fix that.
separate conversation. We got a question behind you, right here.
Yeah, I had a question about gerrymandering and how the redistricting has affected our elections and how it will potentially affect future elections if it continues.
Gerrymandering. Who wants that one? I could.
Okay, well, I mean, I think voting in state and local elections really matter, right? And that's the message that we have to get out. If you are on the winning team, when the census rolls around, then you get to make those lines, unless the states start to move to some sort of an independent commission to fix that problem.
This is another one too, where I just think that. So my son is absolutely exercised about gerrymandered congressional districts. To Mary's point, if you care, get into the mix, win some elections, control how those boundaries are drawn, and don't complain about it when you lose. But you got to win at not just the presidential races, not just the House and Senate races. You got to get into the state houses. You got to get into the local elections, because that's where those decisions are made. So I think we're going in the back.
So we saw a huge drop in voter turnout this year. I think it was 15 million between people who voted for Biden and then now for Kamala Harris. What do you guys think happened? Why did people not show up? Why did they not come out to vote?
I mean, one idea I would have is just kind of oversaturation. And one thing I've heard from multiple people, just in my daily life, is a lot of people saying they didn't like either candidate. And I think if you're in a position where neither option seems good in your estimation, then it's gonna reduce your motivation to actually participate in the process. And so I think for a lot of people, I think politics has gotten so nasty and so vulgar. I think a lot of people are just turned off by it, frankly. And so in my view, I think that's one of the factors contributing to it.
Janine, thoughts?
Well, I was at the polls taking photos of voter turnout activity on Election Day, and I will say that I observed several people showing up at the wrong polling site and being sent somewhere else. Hopefully they did go somewhere else and didn't just give up and not vote at all, but with all the information that is out there, it is still a problem getting the right information at the right time for that voter who wants to know where to go and what to do. And so you have to wonder, what more can we do to make this process easier and to get that information to them so that it's easy to do? You know, and maybe it has a lot to do with, is voter access difficult? You know, does it have to always be done in person? You know, some states are kind of moving to ballots that you're not doing in-person voting anymore. I mean, we have expanded voter access. We've allowed, in Rhode Island, like, oh my goodness, we had quite a lengthy early voting period. And you saw people love early voting and mail ballots. Those really were skyrocketing. So you're going to see that trend continue. There's a lot being done, so I'm not sure what the answer is to address the concern, but we'll keep working on it, right?
Yeah, I think too, 2020, I think, is always going to have an asterisk, right, in terms of turnout, because it was COVID. And there were tons of exceptions made in terms of the type of voting that they allowed people to do. And then after 2020, some of that got constrained. Some states opened access up more, giving more access to the ballot in terms of mail-in ballot, and other states constrained it, right, and made it more difficult to do absentee ballot or mail-in ballot. They wanted you in person. And so I think that difference between 2020 and 2024, in part, it is attributed to that. But I also think, because we can't be up here and not talk about the Electoral College, that doesn't always inspire folks to go, right? It's the only election of all the elections that occur in this country that is not won and lost on the popular vote. The only one, right? And so if you already know, you know, I was fighting with my kids. They're in college. They're in Boston. You got to get registered. You got to go vote. And, you know, one of my sons said, is it going to really matter? Everybody knows how Massachusetts is going to go. And I was like, yes, you'll bring shame to the family name. But I do think there is that disincentive if you don't live in a battleground state to actually vote. And so that depresses turnout.
In other states.
In other states, yes, exactly.
So we've got one here and then there, and then we're going up there. So let's start right here.
I understand that the Democrats probably really missed a huge opportunity to tap into what was really going on in this country, clearly. I mean, you look at that map and you see little New England's blue and then the rest of the country red. And I almost think she was doomed from the start, from the short time that she had to run but the point is, I don't think she could have run a perfect campaign. She didn't have enough time. But my biggest question is, how does Donald Trump get to behave the way he behaved in the last 2 weeks and win? Are people that angry? And even if they are, why is it acceptable for someone to be that crass? What's happened to our culture? I mean, yes, it seems like we've got more religion because they all came out for Donald Trump, but then on the other hand, why aren't they being, you know, Christian-like? Right. How did that happen?
So I'm gonna offer a alternative theory of the case. Some of you know what I spend most of my time looking at is misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and typically coming from foreign sources. There's a technique that goes back to the Cold War. It's something called reflexive control. And basically what it is that if you provide information into the stew of information that is so hot, so toxic, that it inspires a reflexive response, then you're controlling the decision-making of your adversary. You typically see this on battlefields, and it's something that armies use. I think that Donald Trump actually uses the professional wrestling sentiment of his campaigns and his rallies and some of the crazy stuff that gets said at those things as a way of distracting us from a serious conversation about policies. That there's maybe even an understanding and apprehension that some of those policies might not be popular, but they're the agenda that he's running on. So if you watch the last 2 weeks or the last 10 days of the election coverage, we had a 30-minute news block on cable news would spend 15 minutes talking about what a comedian said at Madison Square Garden, and not talking about what's going to happen in Ukraine, not talking about real choices in the economy, not talking about what a tariff is going to do to regular Americans, right? All of those policy issues get left aside because, frankly, Democrats and the media take the red meat and respond to the outrage and the ridiculousness rather than focusing on issues that actually speak to the lived experience that Americans are feeling around the country. I think he's a lot smarter than people give him credit for. Yeah, question.
So one of the biggest critiques of the Biden-Harris administration was their dealing with foreign policy, and then to your point about the new minority vote that Trump achieved in this election, I think about the complex Jewish vote, the Latino vote, the black vote. Do you think that Trump will alter how he handles his foreign policy to cater to this new population that got him in office? Or will it be just a complete change of what the Biden administration did, or will he do his own thing? Where do you guys see that heading?
Want to say that?
Yeah.
I think that candidate Trump has been crystal clear about his skepticism over U.S. support for the war in Ukraine. And some of that has to do, I think, for his affinity for the Vladimir Putin, for strongmen leaders in general, whether we're talking about Viktor Orban in Hungary or Kim Jong-un in Korea. I think that is going to shape his sort of transactional approach to foreign policy, which is different from the legacy of Democrat and Republican administrations since the end of the Second World War, which was not based on transactional personal relationships with individual leaders around the world, but really on building a rules-based system that would protect American interests regardless of the ebbs and flows of political power in Washington or other capitals around the world. And so I think that my own personal view is that he's going to make those decisions based on the personal relationships that he has with leaders or that he wants to have with leaders in other capitals, rather than necessarily on this traditional approach that's based on a view of America's national interests being best protected by an international system that protects those interests. That might be a really wonky explanation. Does that make sense, though? Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Back of the room.
So I'm an international student from Japan, and I'm wondering what this result will bring to the students from other country in the U.S.
That's a great question.
That is a great question.
Anybody want to venture a response?
Well, education and immigration, students come here and they have a great experience here and they'd like to actually establish a career working in the country. Whether that system, we have a broken system, we heard a lot about that, but if you enjoyed your time and want to build a life and maybe start your career and launch it in the U.S., will that become more difficult than it already is? I think those are questions that are worth, probing and looking into, because that's an open-ended question, I would say.
I think there's a lot of noise, a lot of sound and fury still to come around immigration in general, and what that's going to mean for everything from international students to people who are here, whether they're documented or undocumented. I think there's going to be a lot of churn around the whole immigration issue in general. We've got a question way in the back, and I know we've got another one up front. And anybody else? Any other questions that we've got left on the table? Okay, 3. Okay, yep. Okay, we'll get to these. Way in the back.
So I was looking at the exit polls for specifically ages 18 to 29, because there's this narrative that Gen Z is in theory more progressive or leans more towards the Democrats, but I looked at the results from this one and it looked like they actually took a 5% hit from Biden's numbers to Trump. It was a 5% swing from Biden to Harris, and then of course like Trump gained 5 points as a result of that. So what do you think is like the cause of Gen Z, who came out, obviously more Gen Z voters could vote in this election compared to 2020? What do you think is like the reason of like the shift of Gen Z more towards Trump?
So I think that shift you're talking about happened across the board, right, for Donald Trump. He picked up, he beat the margins big time. And, you know, I think it's the current, this is my opinion, I think it's the current state of, you know, the political climate that we're living in. I think economy is front and center. I think your generation is concerned, rightfully so, about student loans. You're concerned about, are you going to be able to buy a house? Are you going to have to go home and live with mom and dad, as my son announced he's going to do, to pay off his student loans, right? What is your future going to look like? And so I think, you know, former President Trump really hit the economy hard in his, you know, in terms of his ads, and I think your generation is concerned about that, and that is at the top of the mind.
Yeah, I think that there's some folks in the room who remember the 1992 campaign wisdom from James Carville, which was, "It's the economy, stupid." And that is, I think if there's a criticism of the Harris campaign, that maybe they didn't focus enough on that issue. We've got a question here.
Hi. Okay, so I think the regional differences are really interesting. So, of course, there are certain areas of the map that are always red and always blue. So, to me, this looks like a very big gap. It's very polarizing. So, are there any ways that we could try to close that gap? Maybe stimulating the economy in certain areas, in certain ways?
You mean be purple everywhere?
Purple everywhere. You know, I think that there's I'm gonna, how do I want to phrase this? I think that there is a problem that, for a long time, Democrats have been criticized for viewing the middle of the country as flyover country. Democrats lived on the coasts, and everybody else that they didn't really care about lived in the center of the country. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's accurate. But it's a perception that's out there. But I do think that Democrats for a long time have neglected large segments of the American electorate and have not really thought about how do you actually talk to people who you might have fundamental disagreements on important issues. Democrats and evangelical Christians are going to disagree on reproductive rights. They're going to disagree on trans and gay students and youth. Is there a way to reconcile that? Is there a way for there to be dialogue between Democrats and those constituencies so that maybe you're not going to get 20, 30, 40% of evangelicals to ever vote for Democrats? But what Donald Trump did in the 2024 election is that he got 5 to 7% of black men and Hispanic men to vote for him. And now we're talking about 320 electoral votes for him as opposed to Kamala Harris. I think the Democrats, I hope, take a very careful look at how they're engaging with constituencies that are beyond their traditional core and really trying to understand and listen. It's part of the big exercise is just simply that of empathy and listening to people and trying to understand, is there some common ground that we can build from? Even if it only picks up 5 to 10%, that could be a real difference maker going forward.
So there was a recent, as much as I love Electoral College game night, there was a recent piece in the New York Times, and there are some scholars that have experimented with polarization and the coloring of the map. Do you know the study I'm talking about? And what they were talking about how this is very stark, right? To your point, this looks red and blue, and boy, what do we have here, right? But just because we've always done it with red and blue doesn't mean we always have to do it with red and blue, right? And if we can work with gradient colors, light blues, light reds, and medium colored, we will start to see a different vision of this map that doesn't look so stark as dark blue, dark red, and that in their experiments at least, that decreased polarization amongst the subjects in their studies in terms of understanding what the other people are thinking about, in terms of, you know, maybe having a little bit of empathy for the other side, being able to discuss issues that, you know, we can come together. There's always more. I have said this forever. There's so much more that unites us than divides us. We just have to find the common way to talk about it. And perhaps getting rid of this stark colored map and using gradients is moving a little bit in that direction.
Great question. So we've got question here. Where are we going? I think we got George, then here, and then two in the back. Where are you? Right here. Okay. We'll go to George, and then we'll come here. Yeah.
I am an immigrant from Syria. We had 16 coups d'etats in 12 years. And growing up, every 6 or 8 months, we'd go on the street cheering for somebody against somebody else. The next week, the reverse happens. I come here and I'm equally confused. There is a state, there's a state with 2 million people, 2 states, 2 million people. In one, 90% vote for, let's say, Democrats. In the other, 60% vote for Democrats. Somehow, there's something called delegates, and they decide what's going to happen. Yeah. So my vote is not the same as your vote, the value of my vote. Why is this confusion?
It's an electoral college question.
Can I just say that when I was thinking about the inferiority complex of Rhode Island, and we only have 4 electoral votes, we don't have 3 like Wyoming. Right. We have 1.1 million people with 4 electoral votes. So do the math and do something like California with, I don't know what the population of California is, a lot. Yeah. With 54 votes, we have more people, more power behind each electoral vote than a Californian voter.
And that's true of a
would
lot
do.
of small states. I think that Vermont actually has the most, a voter
The
in
most
Vermont
power.
has the most power when it comes
So
to
think
that.
of it that way.
It's a legacy of the Declaration. It's just the way the system is engineered, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but that's where we are. Question over here.
Yeah, as a future educator, what should we look at in terms of the Department of Education in the future?
Future of the Department of Education.
What did you, like, how long has it got?
Yeah, there really is no, I agree, yes, there really is no way of knowing. I mean, I do think there's been talk, there often has been talk of doing away with the Department of Education. That has never happened, but you can never say never. And depending on, the Republicans are going to be controlling the Senate. They'll have Donald Trump in the White House. They will likely control the House. They're going to be able to run the table on a lot of initiatives that they want to pass, and so it's quite possible that they might finally get this through and, dissolve the Department of Education. I still think it's unlikely, but.
Well, we'll see. We've got a question right here.
Organized labor, their move to seeing the Republican Party as a champion, I think that fascinates me as to why it's happening. Do we in the Northeast that are more, it's a difficult, I don't know if I'm saying this correctly, have more college degrees per person than the Midwest? Is that influencing it? I don't know. Or don't we know how to talk to them?
Bill, labor?
Yeah, so, I mean, one thing I've also been thinking about, not to get back to my Franklin Roosevelt kick, but I would clone him and bring him back if I could. I mean, one of the things that Roosevelt did that transformed the political landscape was creating something called the New Deal Coalition, which was basically the foundation of the Democratic Party's support from his election in 1932 up until the late 1960s, and you get Nixon's Southern strategy starting to change all that. But what the New Deal Coalition was this coalition of various social groups that Roosevelt was able to bring together into a highly effective political organization. Organized labor was one of the keys to that New Deal coalition. I think one of the things that ended up happening by the time we get to the mid to late 1960s is that you had some measures, particularly under Lyndon Johnson, that were moving the country in the direction of, for example, things like affirmative action. And the idea among organized labor that their jobs were being threatened, for example, and that maybe the Democratic Party, by helping the African American population, was no longer the great champion of organized labor. And for example, in 1968, you have George Wallace running as a third-party candidate. George Wallace, particularly after the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, who was kind of the great champion of labor before he was killed, George Wallace very much moved into that particular aspect of the electorate after Kennedy was gone, and in some cases kind of became their champion. He didn't get any electoral votes outside of the Deep South, but it goes back to what I said right at the beginning of our session here, that fear and anger motivates people and makes them question their alliances. It makes them question which party is looking out for them. And I think with organized labor, they determined that in this era, their bet is better off with Donald Trump. There's also been some criticism of the Democratic Party. I remember a lot of this being directed at Hillary Clinton in particular, but that the Democratic Party has kind of forgotten the working class and has become more Wall Street focused. And I think that certainly factors into it as well. So historically, I would say those are the best answers I can give you about how that transformation has come about.
Super. We've got time for one more question. We'll do two more questions.
My question is, based on all the religions that got involved and their attitude towards women and productive rights, the young male targets, I mean, I heard people saying, I would never vote for this person because she's a woman. What do you see as the role for women in the future? Because I think we're going backwards. I'm old enough to have seen the bra burning and the whole business, and I've also been through World War II. So what do you see happening for women in the future?
As a man, I'm not answering that.
Do you want to try?
Well, I can say that I'm driving in my car and I listen to talk radio and I hear a caller start talking about toughness. Right? You heard a lot of, that word tough got used a lot. And I heard this caller one going, we're not ready for a woman president. And then it was Bill Bartholomew who was guest hosting, and he kind of shut it down. He's like, we're going to a commercial now. Like, we're not going to have that conversation. We're not going to even buy into the idea that somehow toughness, first of all, is a thing that is that's important in leading a country. With like, tough has to be somehow connected to masculinity, and then it can't be discussed in the essence of a leadership profile that we want for anything. I disagree with the man's use of the pronoun we, because he was suddenly talking for everyone, like including me, that we're not ready. So, but that conversation keeps happening. And so after that day, I contacted a retired Naval War College professor. I was like, I need a commentary because this thing is happening. And so we ran her commentary about, okay, this is not the conversation we should be having. What should we be talking about? And let's look at the fact that we have had women presidents in other countries who've done quite well. And so why do we have this myth happening here? And so that conversation still happens. Who are the people starting it? And it was a man who shut it down too, because he was hosting it. So I think people get it. But even when we were doing our poll for Rhode Island Current, there had been like a lot of sample questions, and we had to weed out what the characteristics of a leader should be. What do you identify with what the president should be like? And toughness ended up somehow and it was another woman who saw her and said, let's get this right off the list. This is not like the qualification, to be tough.
So I'm also a mother. to a 14-year-old daughter. And so this morning when she woke up and she said, so is it only a man that could beat Donald Trump? And, you know, that was a gut punch, right? Because that's what she is internalizing. That's what she is thinking. And my concern for young women everywhere is that they are going to think that they can't do that they can't be in a leadership position, that it is, in her words, only a man, you know, only Joe Biden could beat him. There's obviously much more complexity that goes with that, but it's concerning, I think, not only as a mother, but as someone who teaches young women. I study gender and politics, and I think we have to find ways to not just help women be more confident in choosing to run for political office, but we also need to have the conversation with men and young boys as well. It can't just be, okay, ladies, this is how you do it, but also we need a conversation with everybody in the room.
I think it's safe to say that misogyny is real. But when I look at the exit surveys, so the margin among those who voted for Democrat women, Clinton was plus 13, Biden was plus 15, so 15 percentage points among women higher than Donald Trump. Clinton was plus 13, Harris was only plus 8. So there's something more than just misogyny at play there, right? There was some sort of broad trend towards Trump that we're going to have to unpack. It's going to take some time. I don't know that we have an answer sitting here tonight. Okay, last question.
Going back to something, question earlier, say the next presidential election coming up, or 8 years, things are better for people generally. The economy is a little better, more balanced. Given two candidates, one of them has broken the law. One of them, he also tends to slander anybody opposed to him or had different ideas, could be sued, etc. Do you think that people more comfortable economically would vote for a more ethical, the more ethical candidate and not give Trump the pass that so many people gave him, thinking that they were going to get a better economic deal? In other words, are people changing in what they'll accept ethically when they look at candidates, when their economic life, daily economic life is at stake? They think it's at stake.
Yeah. Let's go right down the line. Let's start with Janine, and we'll come back this way.
I'll use the Obama motto, hope. You hope so. You know, let's see what happens in 4 years. We've seen it before, right? Or his past performance, no indication of the future behavior. Maybe we'll see. We'll see.
Bill.
I think the thing that's jumping into my head right now is I read an interview with a male college student, not here, just to be clear, and this male college student said the president doesn't need to be a moral person. And when I read that, I won't repeat what I first said because, you know, I shouldn't do that in a public venue. But, and maybe I'm more traditionalist when it comes to this, I do think character matters in presidents. I am not saying that they are not flawed in many ways. Everybody is. But, and I don't really want to end this on such a negative note, but I think over the next 4 years, we're going to see that character does matter. And I would certainly like to think that your scenario is correct. But I think I'm also a little concerned that people would make that decision to vote for a president who does have all of these legal issues, criminal issues, obvious character issues over just the economy. And I understand that the economy, it is the economy, stupid, as James Carville said. But for me personally, that is very troubling. and hopefully at some point that will change.
All right.
So I think Donald Trump is a really unique character in American politics. And what you describe for almost every other person running for any office, not the presidency, but other offices, those types of things have taken them down. He's unique in this, in the way that he is, you know, Teflon Don, that the stuff just doesn't stick. So, you know, I'm a glasses half full person, maybe. You know, if what we see at other, you know, state level races, that kind of stuff will bring down a candidate, then, you know, it should hopefully also bring down some future candidate that way.
Folks, I want to thank all of you for just a really great conversation. And I want to thank Janine Weisman, Bill Leeman, Mary Anderson for fielding these questions and for contributing to such an important conversation. A round of applause for all of us. We have, the Pell Center's got one more event this semester. It's Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All with Suzanne Nossel, who's currently the CEO of PEN America. She's about to become the CEO of Freedom House. That is on November 13th at 7 p.m. I hope we'll see you there. Thank you all for coming tonight.
Yeah, I told my students that she got
She's a real big deal.
It's a really big